Welcome everybody to the Mixed project webinar. The Mixed project is part of Horizon 2020, or funded by Horizon 2020, and it's exploring different types of integrated livestock and agroforestry throughout Europe. In a Scottish perspective, we're looking at integration of grazing livestock and cropping systems, and this project has been run by Christine, Robin, Zach and myself, as you see here, and we've got Hugh, who I'll introduce in a minute. We're in year one, or just finishing year one of this project, and this is a 3-year project that's running at the moment. So our speakers today start off with Zach Reilly, who's a consultant based in the Forfar office. He's going to be running us through the project and the progress that we've made so far. Then we have Robin Walker, who is a researcher based with SRUC at Cribston, who will run through the results of the trials that we've done so far and some of the things that we've found. And then last but definitely not least, who's just fresh off the tarty harvester, we've got Hugh Black from Backboath Farms, who will give a farmer's view on integrating livestock into his arable farm, and who's currently or entering into year 3 of Grazing Cereals. So to try and make us as interactive as possible, there is a chat function on here. If anybody's got any questions, please pop them into the chat as we go along, and we'll try and answer them at the end of each of the sections. First up is Zach, who is going to tell us a bit about the project so far. We are recording this, by the way, folks, so just so you know, and the recording will be made available once we've edited it a little bit. And it'll be available for other folk to watch in due course. So I'll just pass across to Zach. We're going to have a couple of polls as we go through the webinar. I'm going to pop them up, and if people could just answer them, hopefully, if the technology works and I can push the right buttons, and answer them as we go along, and it just makes the thing a little bit more interactive as we go. So Zach, I'll just pass across to you.
Thanks, David. I'll just share my screen. So can you see that okay, David? You nod. Yeah, thumbs up from Hugh. Super.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so my name's Zach Reilly. I work for SAC Consulting based out of the Forfar office. Just looking at the attendees so far, I think I know most of you. So hopefully no surprises from me. And I'm just going to, over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, I'm just going to kind of give you a background to the story, the project, what we've done so far, and why we're holding a webinar on grazing cereals. So going back to 2018, I think I've got my years right here. It was an awful dry summer, and quite a few people had a bit of a forage shortage. Grass wasn't really growing because it was so dry. And one of my colleagues' clients suggested he grazed his cereals. It was, to be quite honest, an off-the-cuff suggestion. Wasn't really taking it too seriously, but kind of got us thinking, well, maybe we can be grazing cereals, and what impact would that have? So the farmer in question was actually Ian down at Balgay there, and although he was quite keen to give it a go, he wasn't just too sure how to go about it. So what we did is we bid for a project through the Rural Innovation Support Service, the RIS groups. These are groups across the country, and they're set up to bring farmers together to support innovation within the industry. You can kind of think of it as a bit of an incubation pot of money to get a small idea kind of up and running and off to a good start. So we were successful getting the RIS group, and as part of that group, what we did is we set up some farmer trials. So this was down at Backboath Farm. We established 2 hectares of winter oats, 2 hectares of winter barley, and 2 hectares of winter wheat, all next to each other. And we subdivided that, or just split it in 2 right down the middle, and grazed the 3 cereals side by side. And this was more out of interest to see, firstly, whether the sheep would take to it. Sheep were grazed on cereals, fairly common. It was fairly common practice back in the 60s. Christine did a bit of digging for us when we started this project, and I think she found some research based out of Wales in the 1960s, but very little done recently. So it's really out of more than necessity of the year that we needed the forage, but also out of interest to see just how the sheep would take. And what we found is that the sheep, they were given preference across all three crops, so they weren't subdivided between the crops. And the sheep went straight to the winter barley, and they ate this down pretty much to the ground. It was very, very bare. And it was only once there was really no winter barley left at all that the sheep started coming across onto the wheat area. And similarly, they grazed the wheat very hard before they turned to the oats. And it took quite a long time for them to start eating the oats. But just through stock and pressure, we got there eventually. So straight away, we learned that the preference of this particular flock, and I can't speak for all flocks, was that they much prefer a winter barley feed to a winter oat feed. So this trial, it was taken to harvest. The farm's actually got a weighbridge on it. And what we found was that the grazed winter barley actually out-yielded the ungrazed winter barley. And that was quite a big surprise to us, primarily because the sheep had grazed this area so hard, and it was really taken right back to the bare ground almost. The wheat, it actually yielded slightly less when it was grazed. It was about 0.4 tonnes per hectare less, just out of these plots, but it wasn't a huge difference, and the trial was fairly straightforward. It wasn't replicated. It was just as I had on that table in the last page, pretty basic. Unfortunately, the winter oats actually went flat in this trial. It's mainly the way the trial was set up that the winter oats ended up getting as much fertilizer as the winter barley or the wheat did, so we weren't able to adjust the yield on that. But beyond yield, we also observed a number of differences, mainly in the ground conditions. The ground seemed quite a bit firmer after it had been grazed, and the tractor man was quite surprised how well he travelled over the grazed areas. However, there was also impact to disease pressure and the number of weeds that came through. The disease was actually less in the grazed areas, and I think this is because the kind of green area of the crop that would be affected was removed, and the weed pressure actually increased slightly, and we think this is due to the disturbance of the pre-emergence herbicide. But all quite interesting points anyway. So what we did find, probably the clearest thing that stood out of the RIS group and the farmer trial, was that we needed a lot more information, a lot more research on this. So we really didn't understand, and probably to some extent don't understand, just exactly how grazing affects the crop growth. There's a lot of differences, tiller numbers, stem height, grains per ear, that hopefully Robin will share some light on in a little bit. We also weren't sure on the practicalities of grazing. So when should we graze? How long should we graze for? What stock and density should we use? Should we use daily shifts, or is a set stock and actually more suitable? The weed and disease pressure, we kind of had an inkling that it made a difference, but we didn't have any solid data to back that up. And then also the impacts on soil health. Integrating livestock into an arable system, is it boosting the biological aspect of the soil, or are they not really on the soil for long enough? So we had a lot of questions, still do have a lot of questions to some extent, but what we did is we took this forward and we put it into the Horizon 2020 MIXED project. So Horizon 2020 is an EU funded project for research and innovation. And the mixed project within Horizon 2020 looks at researching into the scope of mixed farming systems in agroforestry. So the main aims is to assess these or explore these different types of farming, mixed farming systems, and their impact on the climate, the environment and society. Alongside the research element of this project, there's also farmer networks, which actually form quite a major part of the project. And this is really to increase knowledge sharing and promote best practice as well. So I thought I'd just give you an overview of the Horizon 2020 project, just to set the scene and see where we sit here in Scotland in regards to the rest of the project. So there's 10 countries involved right across Europe. So they're the green shaded countries on the map to the right there. And in those 10 countries, we've got 19 partner organisations. So it's a huge project. And these partner organisations of ours are looking at mixed systems, and we've broadly categorised these into 3 different types of mixed systems. So we've got arable crops and livestock, which is obviously where the grazing cereals falls. We've got energy crops or forestries, again linked with livestock. And we've got fruit and nut trees or bushes, again linked with livestock or arable crops. And the diversity of mixed projects is quite impressive. There's mixing livestock with cork plantations in Portugal to pigs and chickens and everything else in between in Germany and France. So it's really quite an interesting project to be involved with, and it's very wide ranging. So the project aims to promote the knowledge and innovation of mixed systems to integrate, to avoid the separation that we see in the specialisation, but to mix farming systems back together again, and develop those systems so they're efficient. We're also aiming through the project to assess the mixed systems in regard to the environment, climate change resilience and ecosystem services. So thinking about these farming systems in a wider context across the countryside. And then we're also aiming to support mixed farmers and transitioning towards mixed systems. And then finally, we're aiming to communicate and disseminate the project results. So we're not quite at that stage for 0.5 just yet, but we'll get there as the project moves on. So thinking more specifically to Scotland, within Scotland we have 2 networks. We have the Grazing Cereals network and another one that I just thought I'd flag up in case any of the participants today were interested. So this is the East-West Grazing Cattle project, and the aim of this project is to integrate livestock across the country. So obviously, livestock's a lot more common on the west, so it's moving cattle from the east to the west for summer grazing, and also from the west to the east for wintering on forage crops. And if this is something that's interest to you, if you let me know, I can put you in touch with Fergus, who's heading this network up, and we can get you involved there too. But in a completely unbiased way, the main project and the story of the show is the grazing sheep, and what we're looking at is as I've mentioned, grazing cereals, a range of cereals and a range of sheep. And here is just some photos from the grazing trials that we had. So within the grazing network, we've got 2 elements. We've got the replicated trials. We decided that after the RIS project, we thought that we needed replicated trials to back up what we kind of had an inkling of what was happening on the ground. So over this last winter, we set up grazing trials at 3 different densities at one of the SRUC farms, Tulloch, just up in Aberdeenshire. And Robin's going to go through just exactly what we did there and what we found. The other part of the project is the linking with farms and commercial crops in Scotland. And these are a couple of photos from Backboath, and Hugh's going to kind of discuss why he's doing that, why he's grazing cereals and the kind of benefits and challenges that he's seen. Just to explain the photos, the one on the left is a crop of wheat, and the red arrow is actually pointing at the line where a fence was in that field. And I'll let you guess which side has been grazed and which side hasn't been grazed. But more widely than just grazing cereals, we're also interested in the mixedness of farms beyond just cereals. And on the right hand side, you've got a cover crop, one of Hugh's cover crops. It's actually been frosted a little bit, which he also grazed last winter. And we're interested in how the integration of livestock into an arable system more widely fits too. So we're quite interested in a host of different ways to mix livestock and crops together. Now, some baseline considerations for the project. I thought this was worth just talking through, just so everyone was kind of on the same page for the next couple of presentations. But really, we're conscious of farmer involvement. This is obviously quite an unusual approach to crop management, and we know that being skeptical about crop damage is probably quite a shrewd way to think. But also we want to address the points of people who are maybe thinking about grazing, but there's issues there that they're maybe not too sure on. We're also aware of the livestock implications. I tend to view the grazing cereals from an arable point of view, but the livestock's obviously a key element here. And that goes from what areas and crops we should be grazing to the nutritional value of the crops we're grazing, and also the animal health and welfare. We're quite often grazing at times a year which probably aren't just the best. And the picture on the right shows some of Hugh's wheat with with snow lying, and I think that was taken the day before our sheep arrived this last winter. And then also the impacts on soil. Is there capping or poaching on the soil? Is it having a structural impact? And is the grazing of sheep actually having any biological impacts? The deposition of manure, is it promoting biological activity? And to be honest, we really don't know at the moment, but it's certainly something we're thinking of. So why would we graze cereals? I've probably given you lots of challenges and problems that can occur. So really, it started off as it's an opportunistic feed source. The cereals tend to be quite high protein content, so the lambs do quite well off it. Secondly to that, there's potential to reduce chemical use, reduction of fungicide use. Whether this is counteracted by an increase in herbicide use is what we're still going to find out. More widely, integrating livestock onto arable farms, I think this is quite an important point for soil health. It also maybe presents winter work for an arable workforce, which probably isn't the busiest time of year for them. And then maybe boost soil health. And I'm sure there's lots of other benefits of grazing cereals, and I'm quite happy to discuss that further with the other panelists today. So beyond the grazing itself, there's actually some pretty wide knock-on effects that we've started to observe after grazing for a couple of years. I think one of the biggest ones is the ability to alter the sowing date of the cereals. So Ian down at Balgay, he's on quite heavy soils there, and he's able to sow his cereals quite a lot earlier than he usually would to promote good ground conditions at establishment. And then use the sheep as a management tool to make sure that the crops are kind of at the right stage going through the winter. So he's able to establish the crops in good soil conditions, but he's also able to manage his peak workload. And I think that as a knock-on effect is quite significant. There's the reduced pesticide use, which I've probably touched on already. There's a small amount of additional income from grazing sheep, which I'm hoping Hugh can expand on. And then there's also changes to crop growth. So we found that the grazed cereals tend to be a bit shorter. So there might be potential savings through growth regulator reduction. There also can be more tillers, so whether that can then impact seed rates and whether we can reduce seed rates because we can compensate for that through more tillers are more of the questions that we're asking at the moment. So kind of next steps of the project, just to kind of get you thinking before I hand over to the other speakers. What we're really keen on is grower engagement. So even if you're not grazing cereals at the moment, we're really keen to talk to you about, you know, the possibility of doing that, or monitoring your crops going forward. Or if you're really not keen on grazing cereals, we're interested in finding out why that might be. So really, I just you know, signpost that we're keen to have this discussion. My email's at the end. I'm sure you've got contact details anyway, but you know, we'd really like to get in touch. We're from a trials point of view as well, we'd also like to, we're going to replicate it again this year, but we've focused on winter barley. You know, there are other crops there that you think might be beneficial, and we're quite happy to discuss that too. And then the wider impacts, predominantly soil health and pesticide use, is what we'd like to explore further. So I'd just like to say thank you. There's a lot of logos there. These are just the other partners across Europe that might be of interest to you. But at that stage, I'll just ask if you've got any questions for me. It's quite a brief run through of the project so far, but hopefully it kind of sets the scene for the other presentations this afternoon.
Perfect. Excuse me. If anybody's got any questions, then you can either raise your hand or pop them in the chat, and we'll be able to answer them at the moment. We did a little poll there just to get things going, asking about if anybody had grazed cereals before. You guys should be able to see that now, potentially, hopefully. So quite a number have not at the moment, but obviously there's quite a bit of interest in it, and a few of you are already down this road of grazing cereals, which is great. Great to hear. With a few more polls as we go along, but if there's no questions for Zach, we will move on to our next speaker, and if anybody thinks of anything, then we can ask Zach later on. So our second speaker this afternoon is Robin Walker, who's, as I said, is a researcher from SRUC at Craveston, where the replicated trial was carried out at Tulloch. So I'll just pass across to Robin, who's going to run through some of the results and bits and bobs that we've found out for our first year of trials. I can see that fine, Robin.
Perfect, excellent. And can you hear me?
Yep.
Good. So yeah, so as Zach kind of said, we'd had a number of pieces of work going on as part of this project. So one of the main things I've been involved with is grazing trials at Craveston in, well, northeast of Scotland. I've got a map just in case you didn't know where it is in a second. But one of the key things we're looking at was this hypothesis of grazing of winter cereals can provide late winter feed, source for ruminants, as well as acceptable grain yields or straw yields as well. So we didn't want to reduce the yield that we were getting from the cereals, but we did want to get this kind of feed benefit. And again, there was this mention of what's it actually doing to the soil. Is there a long-term impact, either positive or negative on that? So that's kind of where we were looking at. This is where we're based, for those of you who don't know, in Aberdeen. So that's where the experiment, the replicated trial was. The other farms that have been trying this were a little bit to the further south, it's sort of in the Angus area. So one of the reasons for looking at this was extreme weather events. So for example, in 2018, there was that really dry summer, which reduced forage availability. And then we've had some kind of really strange wet and cold seasons as well, which have all impacted on availability. So this slide here really just gives a regional climatic average of kind of what we're expecting. And typically you'd be expecting around 850 mils of rain a year. But it's been falling at rather strange times, strange parts of the year, not always in the winter. And again, we've had these dry spells as well. So what we're trying to do is kind of counteract that and trying to get a buffering effect. in terms of what we can grow, and winter cereals is one area that we're looking at. So in terms of the actual trials that we were looking at, I'm assuming you can see my mouse on the screen, hopefully, because it would be quite useful. Can you see my mouse?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, so this field plan that we've got here, this top field, this field A1 is this one that we can see on the side of the hill, and the one below it is this field A6. So last year, well, I suppose it was autumn 2020, winter wheat was sown into this field at the top, this field A1, and winter barley in this field A6, this lower one here just next to the houses, with these basically varieties and sowing dates and agronomy aspects that went in. So the winter wheat was Sundance and was sown on the 8th of October. And sort of agronomic characteristics. So it was chosen basically because it's fairly high yielding, pretty good resistance to septoria and rust. It's fairly tall straw, and it's got distilling market opportunities. But most of the work that we looked at was predominantly based around the winter barley, partly because of what Zach said earlier, that when they had the three different crops growing in the field, the sheep tended to kind of navigate towards the barley first, and then the wheat, and then the oats. So we tended to focus on the winter barley in this instance. So the variety that was grown in last season was Tower, and it was sown on the 29th of September. So there was only just over a week's difference between the wheat and the barley. And again, it's known for its good yield in the north, moderate disease resistance, and moderately tall straw, and excellent tillering. So that was another thing that was mentioned about how did tillering was tillering affected by the grazing. So that's kind of where we are located. The other thing I should mention is the altitude is about 160 meters, so it's not exactly sea level. But that's where we are based, and this particular piece of work, the replicated work, was done. In terms of soil analysis of the field, pH was just below 6 at the time. Phosphorus was medium low. Potassium was pretty low actually. Magnesium medium low, and the calcium was quite high. So obviously, fertilizer for the whole field was based around the soil analysis that went on, and the whole area was done, not just the trial area, and that basically the field was managed apart from the grazing aspect, which we implemented as the whole field. The other thing is, I should say that copper and magnesium, manganese deficiency was there, so these were applied as well as part of the kind of the main field inputs. So in terms of the winter barley grazing experiment, as I said, we focused on this one, which was the lower of the two fields I showed in the previous slides. One of the things that was raised was, well, what does the dry matter yield look like of the winter crop? Because most people haven't really been looking at them in terms of grazing them, so they tend to kind of look at them further on in the season. But because we wanted to kind of use this as grazing, it was like, well, how much dry matter have we got? What's the stocking capacity or likely to be? So one of the things we actually did was take as you can see in the bottom right, quadrats for the field. So we started these in, I think it was November, early November, excuse me. And we took these periodically right through to, I think it was May was the last time. So we've got a selection of about 10 different dates, which we've got physical data, sort of biomass data of the material from the quadrats. So we did multiple quadrats, I think it was 5 per sampling point. And we matched these with photographic evidence, so you can see the tram lines in the field, so you can get an indication of what it maybe looked like in terms of biomass, ground cover, etc., and bulk. And then we've got the more detailed pictures of the actual quadrats themselves. So this was before we took the material, and obviously this is after the material. So the material taken off that, we went off to the lab, dried it, and got the dry matter indication of that. And obviously we averaged over the 5 quadrats taken, and we did this for both the winter barley but also for the wheat field as well, even though we weren't actually going to be grazing that this last year. So the idea is we'll put these together to give a sort of visual guide of what the dry matter might look like at various points in time over the winter period leading up to when you like to grazing. So in terms of when we actually grazed, because there was rather strange weather, we were hoping to get in sort of February time, but it ended up being mid-March. Yeah, so that's kind of what we did in terms of leading up. And this just gives you an indication of on the left, we've got the winter barley dry matter. So there's obviously the date along the bottom here. This is kilograms per hectare. The winter wheat is on the right hand side. So this is actually half the axes figure there. So just need to bear that in mind, they're not matched. But there was this kind of winter kill or slowing down of the biomass over the kind of the December sort of February period. So we had this really cold spell and wet spell as well, and it started taking off again in the spring for both crops actually. Some of the indications there, we've got ash here, so it started off quite high, actually increased towards the Christmas period, and then it tailed off quite significantly when we got into March. In terms of crude protein, it actually started off fairly high in the early part of sort of November, December, and then gradually it dropped off and dropped off quite significantly again from sort of March onwards. D values as well, they not bad, pretty pleased with those, being close to 100% for the early part anyway. And again, these dropped off again once the crop really started growing strongly in the spring. And then we've got the ME values as well, which again were fairly steady and just started to tail off again in the spring. And we kind of got a almost similar kind of situation with the wheat. The ash values tended to be a little bit, well, again, fairly strong to start with and then tailing off again. Crude protein was pretty good. If anything, it was more consistent over the time period that we were measuring these, through late November, actually through to May in this instance. So they were better, whereas they tailed off a lot with the winter barley. D values were okay, similar in many ways to the winter barley, but again, they didn't tend to drop off quite so much later on in the season. And then the ME values again were pretty consistent throughout the season as well. So there's subtle differences between the two crop types, and particularly from the growth spurt in the kind of the spring, March onwards. So that was kind of just getting an idea of what the crops look like and the kind of basic dry matter measurements and some of the quality of that dry matter at various points into the season up to when the crops may get grazed. Then we actually had this field experiment where we actually had the grazing sheep on them. This isn't an actual field itself, it's just a sort of a schematic of it. But we had a transition area, and then we had planned to have 4 different treatments. So we had either a 0 grazed plots, a control plot, and then we had 3 grazing. So we had heavily grazed, which we had as 3 days of grazing, 2 days grazing, or 1 day grazing, and they're randomized in a block design. So there's 3 replicates of those 4 different treatments. So that's how they were kind of laid out in the field, in the winter barley field. So these were grazed in mid-March, in 2021. We'd calculated the areas from the quadrats that we'd had to allow us to have 5 grazing sheep per area. So these plots, I think they were 12 by 15 meters long. And the idea was that we had a maximum of 3 days grazing, which matched with the previous slide in terms of the treatments that we had. But actually, when we got to it, we'd graze them for up to 2 days, and it looked like there was hardly any material in the ground, which is kind of what you're seeing in the bottom left hand. This plot just along here had been grazed for 1 day, and the one here that you can see, which is pretty lush, was the one that hadn't had any grazing at all. So theoretically, some of these 2-day plots were supposed to be grazed for 3 days, but we didn't. We just felt, partly due to welfare, but we just didn't want the ground to get too damaged. So we actually took the sheep off. So we only actually had 3 treatments in that point in time. We didn't feel there was sufficient forage for them. But as you can see here on the left-hand side, essentially it's the same view, and I can't remember when this was taken, but it was much later in the summer. It was almost impossible to actually see any difference visually from where these plots had been compared to what they'd been like in mid-March when we actually did the grazing. So obviously we did some measurements on all of this. So one of the things we were looking at was things like tillering and disease and weed pressure, and there really wasn't any obvious differences between any of the 3 treatments that we ended up with, the 0 grazed and the 1 day and the 2-day grazing. And again, we did some soil health measurements as well. So we looked at VES. So this is on the right hand side, the visual soil health score. It's mostly to do with soil structure, and also worm counts as well. And there was really no significant difference at all. So going back to here, there was no real difference in the crop during the season or the soils at the end of the season. We also yielded the plots using a plot combine. So we had 2 strips up, the same length of each of the different plots, and then we bulked those together. And there was no statistical difference between the plots that we had, so the 0, the 1 day, or the 2 day. And it was a bit of a surprise given what the plots looked like when the sheep had actually just finished grazing. But as going back to this picture here, visually, it didn't look like there was much going on. And actually that kind of transposed through to the grain yields. So the average of the 3 treatments was just over 8 tons per hectare. And there was no real clear trend between treatments. So there wasn't almost, as we had the 0, the 1 or the 2, there wasn't an increase or a decrease as we went through that. I think the one that was the least was actually the 1 day grazed. So, but it wasn't significantly different. And that actually was the same for the straw as well. There was no clear trends or significant difference between the straw yields for them, which actually is quite a good thing because it means you're getting the grazing without reduction in the yield. Moving on to some of the data we got from Hugh's farm at Backboath. I mean, he'll give a bit more detail about his experiences, but what we did, he had a number of fields that had grazed and ungrazed cereals. Some of them have been grown using different establishment methods. So this is kind of like a 2-row sowing. He also had other establishment where it was much more kind of conventional, so you didn't have these gaps between it's much more evenly spaced row spacing. Also had some fields that had different seed rates, and I'll come on to the data for that in a moment. But basically we had dry matter measurements towards the end of April from all the different fields and the grazed and ungrazed. You can actually see here there's a difference. There's a sort of a line across here, and I think this is from the seed rate experiment. And then we had another data sampling towards the end of June, and we were looking at things like the tiller numbers, weed scores. So we had a 1 to 9 score. So basically 1 was extremely weedy and 9 was no weeds, and also a disease severity score. So that was based on a percentage per plot. So anything with a low percentage meant there wasn't very much disease there, which was good. We did 3 replicates treatments, or three samplings per area. I mean, the trial wasn't replicated itself, but we did sort of sub-sampling within each of the bigger areas. And when it came onto the grains per ear, we actually had 30 heads taken randomly at 10 sample points, so 10 ears from 3 sample points across the area. So, as I said, several fields were sampled. I'll just kind of give an example of some of them rather than going through all the data from every single field. So I kind of summarized it a bit in the next few slides. So this happened to be the pump field, which had different seeding rates. So as you can see here, it's the same kind of, the first column is the same information. So you've got whatever the seed rate is. And then we've got grazed yes or no. So there was 140 kilos per hectare, 160 or 190 kilos per hectare. And this was the dry matter. So this is the one that was taken towards the end of April. And the grazed material tended to be lower than the one that hadn't been grazed at the different seed rates. And at the higher seed rate, you tended to get more dry matter as well in that particular instance. In terms of grains per ear, again, we've got the same setup with the seeding rates and whether it was grazed or not. It wasn't a massive amount of difference. I think as the seed rate increased, you tended to get no real difference in the grazed ones, but in the zero graze plots. So this one, and this one, you tended to get an increase as the seed rate was reduced, but only very, very marginally, wasn't really significant. Some of the other things we looked at was the tiller counts, and this, again, this is just one example. Some of the other fields didn't necessarily correlate too closely with this, so sometimes they were higher, sometimes they were lower. So we looked at fertile tillers, the weed score. So if you remember when I said the 9 was virtually no weeds, basically there was very few weeds there. Again, plant heights as well we looked at, so there wasn't a huge difference between them. And one of the things it did kind of show was septoria. So again, it was really low levels, low percentages, but there was a slight increase in terms of disease for the crops which hadn't been grazed, which again I think was something that Zach had mentioned had been observed in some of the previous years. So if you look at the first 2 columns, there's maybe slightly more septoria in the ungrazed plots in the lower seed rate, similarly with the middle one, and then at the higher one as well. So I'm going a bit more kind of general now, but in terms of the dry biomass sampling, dry biomass tended to increase for the ungrazed plots compared to the equivalent grazed ones for all the sample fields. As I said, there was about 6 or 7 fields that were sampled. The pump field, which was one of the field names, was a relatively greater increase in the dry biomass as the seed rate increased. So that was the previous slide that I showed. This is from the pump field. And again, the 2-row establishment treatments, you can see here, this is a grazed area and there's an ungrazed area next to it. I think this is the conventional sowing on the left-hand side. But the 2-row established treatments appear to have greater dry biomass compared to the conventionally established plots in Milton Field for both ungrazed and grazed treatments. Move on to the next one. So one of the other things that we're interested in was tiller numbers. And although these look very, very similar pictures, one of them is from grazed and one of them is from the ungrazed. And as you can see, no clear indication of grazing difference in the tiller number, which was what we found, basically very little difference at all. Some fields had increased tiller numbers for grazed plots, others had increased tiller numbers for ungrazed plots. So there was no clear trend amongst these different fields that we looked at. There was also no clear difference in the tiller numbers between the seed rates, which was one of the tables I showed earlier. The 2-row establishment treatment produced more tillers per 50 centimetre row than the conventionally established crops, and they were obviously slightly more open at the edges of these where they were growing because of the slightly wider gap between them. But if you actually started looking at it per metre squared, there was not really as big a difference, although slightly, probably a slightly higher number of tillers in the 2-row established compared to the conventional, but it was pretty marginal. The other thing we were interested in was weeds and diseases. So we saw one of the field, the tables from I think it was the pump field earlier on, but in general, most of the fields had very few weeds at all. So they'd had herbicide applied to them. One field which had quite a lot of weeds in there was weedier, was the Slade 50 field, which was weedier. But in that particular field, there was no real difference between the grazed or the ungrazed areas. And there was a suggestion, although it wasn't clear in the data, that the grazed area was perhaps slightly weedier, but it was fairly minimal. But in terms of the other fields, there was very little difference in weeds. Disease levels across, moving on to the disease levels across all fields was fairly low, and again, we would have had fungicides applied. Grazed plots in general had slightly lower incidences and severity of disease than their ungrazed comparison in the same field, but it was pretty marginal. And in the field that we had the different seed rates in, I think we kind of mentioned that when we went through the table. The mid-seed rate had arguably the highest level of disease, although it was still pretty low. It was about 5 or 6%, I think. With the lowest seed rate having the least disease, although it was really marginal. And there was another field, Milton, that had both the 2-row establishment method and more conventional sort of standard row spacing. In that one, the conventionally established plots appeared to have less disease than the 2-row established plots, so around 4% compared to 9%. Still fairly low levels of disease though. So there did seem to be some impact of how the crop was established in terms of disease. But the biggest difference was really between fields, with this Milton one being the highest disease of all of them that were looked at. So plant height was another thing that we're interested in. So there was mention earlier of what's the impact in terms of things like growth regulators, or if you were growing them for straw, perhaps for livestock, if you actually had livestock there. So grazed plots were generally slightly shorter than their comparative ungrazed plots, but it was pretty small in terms of the fields that we looked at. We were looking at 2 to 5 centimeters, so not much difference from most of them at all. In the field with the different seed rates, the lower seed rate treatments were marginally shorter than the equivalent grazed or ungrazed mid seed rate plots, and the higher seed rates were marginally taller, although not significantly so. So basically, the greater the number of plants per meter squared tended to have slightly shorter, slightly taller plants in this field, but it wasn't the case for all of them. The exception to this was this post office field. So ungrazed plots were substantially shorter than the grazed plots, so there's quite a difference, 10 centimetre difference on that particular field. But say it didn't hold through for all the other fields that were looked at. But the biggest difference was really between the different fields. I mean, one of the fields actually had a crop of oats in it, and they were taller, which you kind of expect because of the crop. But most of the other fields were actually in wheat, and there wasn't an awful lot of difference between them. So another thing that was looked at was grains per ear. So again, very little difference between the data that we'd collected. So between grazed or ungrazed plots, irrespective of which field we were looking in, between the different methods of establishment. So we've got this kind of 2-row establishment and the kind of more conventional standard row spacing. And also between the seed rates in the field that had the different seed rates. There was very little difference in terms of grains per ear. So another statement here, arguably the number of grains per head increased for ungrazed plots as the seed rate was reduced, but it was pretty low, not pretty marginal. But again, the biggest difference really in terms of grains per ear was between the fields, discounting the kind of the oats being different from the wheat. But in terms of the wheat, the fields that had wheat growing in them, the biggest differences were the different fields. And that's it, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Robin. Just a couple of things. Robin, can you put your slide back to the tables with the different energy and crude protein, please?
Yep, sure. That one? No, not that one. That one.
Yeah, just to give folk a bit of a kind of comparison, the silages that go through our laboratory for this year, the average crude protein is 113 at the moment, and the average ME is 10.7. So all of these, well, you can see the winter barley and the winter wheat is significantly higher than what an average silage through our lab at the moment is. So it's just as a bit of a comparison for folk.
You'd mentioned something in one of our other discussions about the D values as well. And anything close to 100% was good. Is that correct?
Yeah. So anything, well, in my book, anything near 100 or over 100 is a dairy quality silage. So you can see they're all in the high 80s or into the 90s. So some good D values there as well. So no, just as a bit of a comparison for that. There is one question, thanks Phil for that, is was there any difference in root biomass?
Well, we didn't measure it, so we can't really say. I mean, the only thing we would have seen in terms of the VES scoring would have had some indication of what the roots were doing, but there was absolutely no, and this was just on the plot, the small plot trial that we did. There was the soil, there was very little difference in the soil at all. There was one plot that was worse than the others, but we kind of knew that because it looked a bit ropey to start with. But in terms of the rest of the plots, there was no real difference, and we haven't got root biomass data. I mean, it's something that we could consider doing, but it is quite time consuming to do.
Yeah, I would say it's something that we need to think about for another year, definitely. So thanks for that, Phil. Good. Okay, is there any other questions for Robin? No. If you could stop sharing your screen, Robin. And Zach, are you going to share Hugh's?
Yeah, I can do. Do you want your photos up just now, Hugh?
You're on mute, Hugh.
There's always one on mute.
There's always one, yeah.
Mute might be more fun for everyone. Hi everyone. We can only see the attendees on our name list, so I know some of you can't see your faces. But so I'm just going to talk about how we do it and a bit of why and how we're getting on with the process. It's we've done 2 full winters now. we started off buying some sheep fencing. We bought 4,000 meters of sheep fencing with a plan to always use half of it for the sheep and the other half prepped for the sheep going into. So we always have 2 fields fenced, whether it's a wheat crop or an oat crop. And then preferably we started thinking, well, we'll have the wheat crop fenced and a stubble with cover on it fenced, so that when the weather came bad, we could walk them off onto the stubble, or they could go themselves. But actual fact, the way it's worked out, we tend to now just have wheat to wheat to wheat to wheat fenced, and oats as well. Because when it does get miserable weather, it doesn't seem to matter too much on our soils if it's too wet or not. I thought that the sheep would make more mess in the bad weather, and it would need the stubbles to rest the ground. But our first year was 2 winters ago, and it was a February we started, and it was horrific. It was the February we got 7 or 8 inches of rain consistently. It was the worst start we could have had, but actual fact, it was the best test we could have got early on, because we've proved it doesn't really matter how wet the land gets with the sheep on it. It seems to be forgiving enough that we're not losing plants, and we're not poaching it too much, and we're not hammering it to the point that it's not recovering. Robin had a few pictures where it had that nice green alleyway and the tram line, and then the individual plots either side. And Robin, you said that after a day or 2 days that your sheep had overgrazed it, and for a welfare issue you should move them on. Well, I'm not a sheep man, so I don't have many welfare issue qualities, but we quite often graze to the bone, and it looks like there's no food. But an example, you had 1 sheep for 36 meters squared. I'm running 1 sheep per 600 meters squared. So you're getting 1 to 2, 3 days maximum. I'm getting 6 to 7 days on that similar sort of equation. We take on, the first year we started, we took in 550 sheep. I think they were 6 years old. They were doing their 5th lambing. They were in lamb. So it's what we got. I asked for hogs, which apparently are sheep without lambs, and we didn't get them. They were heavier. They looked fine to me, but they were definitely heavier because they were older and lamb, and they didn't make much mess. They didn't poach the ground too much. The second year we got 300 hogs, and the only difference we got with that was that they were lasting longer per field because there was less of them. And it was actually easier from my point of view having 300, because I could move them every 6 days, 7 days, rather than moving 500 every 4 or 5 days. It just took the workload off. So we moved around the farm slower, and actually that's not a bad thing, because it'll always land a weekend, no doubt, if we have too many. So I don't have a hard fast rule that we're following clearly. We just take on, yes, the sheep farmer brings the sheep across from a grass farm on a dairy. We tend to start late January into middle of February. Why? Because I want them off end of March, and that's roughly how quickly I think it takes to get around our farm. Also, we don't want to hit the whole winter with sheep. We'll hit the tail end of it, that'll be fine. We could start grazing now, but by Christmas we'll be finished. We may get a second flush, but I really doubt it in Carmiley. It's not that growthy in the winter. So I think we'll just continue what we're doing and start after the new year, and work into the better weather rather than working into the bad weather. It also suits the sheep guy because he's got grazing at that point up till Christmas, comes to me, and he leaves me and takes them straight back up the hill to go back up. This year was we managed to graze them longer than anticipated, purely because we had a stubble with a green crop manure in it, or a cover in it, not a big cover, but with some annual meadowgrass at the base as well. And we managed to hold the sheep right through to April. that was a bonus boost for me because we got a longer income, not necessarily on wheat crops, but on the farm. And that proved quite well for both me and for him. He was absolutely delighted. He said this year the condition of the sheep were better than expected and looking tremendous, but probably because a lot of the growth they were eating in the last 2 to 3 weeks was active fresh growth, and the sheep were getting on great, eating steadily, very settled and performing well for him. So he was happy and delighted, because it's a bit of an ask to bring sheep to an arable farm, I think, when they're new to it. So back to start, we have it's called Kiwi Quick Fit fencing. I just found it at Groundswell one day. They were demonstrating it. It's a one-man band erection and dismantle. I use it on the side of a golf buggy. The first year I did it carrying it manually, and very quickly learned I'm not going to do this for the rest of my life. I'm not keen enough. So we can carry the golf. I've got a jack with a golf buggy up. We didn't buy quads because we've got children and I don't want them to roll it. So we bought a golf buggy, and the golf buggy does all the sheep work for me, with me in it. I put all the pegs in the back, and if a frame goes on the side of the buggy, which has 3 sheep wires. The 3 sheep wires are only 300 meters long, so I'm working in sets of 300s. A fence post every 10-12 yards. It's quite light fencing, and you can get away with wider. I can lay 2 kilometers on my own in about an hour and a half to 2 hours, when all is going well and the fences are not knotting and there's no issues. It's quite quick. Unreeling it, you just do the same process in reverse on my own with the buggy, and it can take slightly longer sometimes if you get snagging, but if you don't rush it, it's again about 2 hours. Now that said, that's all going well. Wind makes a bit of an issue. Ground conditions make a bit of an issue, but you can increase output massively by taking someone with you, even if it's one of the kids, just to help unsnag the odd bit of wire. It's a plastic and wire poly fence wire we use. It's what it is. It seems simple. It's on its 2nd season. It's all doing pretty well. I hope to get at least 10 years out of it, because we're not using it hard. We'll erect and remove it 12 times each roll in a year, and then put it away for the summer. It costs about £1 a metre for the kit and the wire. So 4,000 meters, £4,000, and the buggy was £3,500. So that's all the investment I've put into it all. The buggy does a lot of other stuff all year round. The fencing is only for the sheep. We've got horses, but we don't use it for that. Apparently it's not safe, they say. But the buggy works for fruit, it works at the farm. The boys use it as a taxi to get farm to farm if there's no vehicles left, and the kids use it as a recreational buggy. It's only on grass tyres. It makes no mess of the fields. It's tremendous. Our land is pretty good for being able to travel in the winter. My brother-in-law is over at Amstruther, and there's no way he said he could walk across a wheat field because of the clay content. This buggy will go everywhere, make no mark, and cut a lot of time out. I tend to walk the fence line every day, one for fitness, health, and it's awfully easier keeping the sheep in than trying to get them back in. I don't drive it every day, the fence line, but we'll at least walk it every day, or my wife will if she's going for a run. The sheep are easy to keep in so far, even though they're blackies coming off the hill. The fence works. It seems to keep them in. We are not having issues that everyone told me I would have with blackies. Wherever we can, we plug into the mains. We do use 12-volt batteries a lot, but whenever we get the chance, whether it's plugged into the back of the church or into a neighbour's garden shed or our shed or whatever, it's easier on the mains. But that said, because we're only in the field for 7 days, I quite often just park the tractor at the fence and use the tractor battery and start the engine, walk the fence line, switch the engine off, and that's it, boosted again for the next few days. So that's one of the other easy ways I do it. the guys, we've got the staff on the farm, they tend to do bits and pieces for me when I need a hand, but I kind of do most of it myself. I choose when they're moving, not the shepherd. I always have a field laid out, ready to go to, and one that they're in. So that if something goes wrong, at least we've got a backup plan for the sheep to move into. I phone the shepherd and say, look, I want you to move the sheep either Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. He'll fit it in on his rounds, and he'll let me know, say that's fine, Tuesday morning, I'll be there. I'll open the fence wires, he'll put the dog in, push the sheep through, and generally half an hour, that's the sheep shifted, and fence locked off in the second field, and I'll start dismantling the first field to put to the third field. It's really simple. I've only tried it once to shift the sheep on my own, and that was a disaster. So it just, as long as I'm organised, he can be there within a time span and they shift easily. We've only had 2 real breakouts of sheep, and it was by fault of, I don't know who. We had plugged into the church hall for power through the window. My dad's the elder, so that would be okay. But someone had shut the kettle off and the plug beside it, which was my battery pack charge. And then the sheep got out 2 days later because there was not much food left and they hopped on the main road. So that was a bit of a killer. Damaged a bit of fence wire Sunday afternoon, and had to use the kids to get them back in. My kids are only young, 9 and under, but just explain, I'm going to shout at you for the next 2 hours as if you're sheep, dogs, and we're going to get them back in. So it's fine. This is one of our kids, but this is really just showing you the fences that we're using. It's really simple. You can put the wires on to the peg whilst driving the buggy. So you don't really stop driving or moving when you're erecting the fence. Driving about 2 or 3 kilometers an hour, connecting the fence post onto the wire, stabbing it in with one foot whilst accelerating with the other foot, and then just keep popping them in until you run out of wire. Put the strainer in, which is the same type of product. There's no wooden posts and no hammer, nothing. It's all this Kiwi Tech fencing, and it's quite simple. I have learned. I try to graze right to the dikes and tidy up the dikes, but it just tends to cause problems with the fence wire being earth or sheep standing on dikes, and also they tend not to eat the grass when they've got wheat to eat. Now, the shepherd was a bit anxious at the very beginning, thinking, well, they'll eat it, but it might take them a while to get to the wheat to get onto it. But we find that when they have a grass opportunity to eat grass, they don't really go for it ever until there's no wheat left. It's the absolute last resort. They seem to get the palate for wheat and they'll stay on wheat. This shows you here just a 2-row, that's the fence going in, that's not grazed yet. We would take that down to the point you can't see green really, and quite comfortably so. Quite often when you get rain, the leaf sticks to the ground when the sheep stood on it, and then all of a sudden you've got nothing to graze, and you get the fear, all you need is a bit of a breeze like today, the leaf flicks up and you've got a green field again, plenty to graze. So often it's just a bit of patience, just keep watching the weather daily, and if you can see the rain is not going to forgive, you have to move to the next field to give them food. But really, it's within a short spell, a lot of forage can pop back up for grazing again. Okay, I've got one more picture. It just shows you a quad bike kitted up properly. Is what we have the golf buggy. This is the same kit. You can see the guy holding the fence wire post. He would stamp that in, having connected it on the move. That's how it should look if it was on a quad, but we don't use that. That's not mine. Biggest problems we've had? I don't know, nothing major. It's just the effort of going out to move sheep in the winter time. There are lots of ups and lots of downs. We're not seeing our yields getting hit. I think there's no measurement in this. It just feels better to have sheep shitting around the farm than carting in manures with diesel tractors and men. We're definitely stripping off any disease if we have any, and that's a bonus. We intend not to use any T0s for fungicide, and the last 2 years have been quite clean years anyway. But by having no leaf there, it's not really even a consideration to go on with a fungicide in T0. So the income from the sheep's good. It's okay. It's not a lot of money, but it's a positive on the. It's a positive. The lack of fungicide going on is a positive. So there's two savings, or an income and a saving together. And that was the basis of my thinking when I started this, as well as just doing something better for the ground without costing me a lot of money, effort, and we've got the facilities. Sheep won't make us millions. I think adding a true value would be if I owned the sheep, but I also see that as an enormous risk when I'm not huge into animal husbandry. So I think we'll just continue bringing sheep in as opposed to owning our sheep.